Thank you, Steve. I confess to being old, but I wasn't old enough to be at Nippur in the 1880s. Though I think it would have been very interesting to have been there. Now, if you were here for the inauguration of the Widener Lecture Hall in April, you may remember that I outlined an exciting new collaboration with my former student and colleague Michael Dante at Boston University to undertake survey and excavation in the Rawanduz-Soran district of Iraqi Kurdistan. I promised at the end of my short talk in April to give you an update on field work in the fall, so I am here this evening to report on our first, and I can tell you, very hot summer in northeastern Iraq. Now, our initiative in Iraqi Kurdistan, and Iraqi Kurdistan includes Erbil, Sulaymaniyah, and Dohuk provinces of northeastern Iraq, or roughly the area in the oval you see on the screen. Our initiative began a couple of years ago when we were talking about and being very pessimistic about the future of fieldwork in the Middle East. I mentioned that we had recently hosted a group of Iraqis at Penn Museum that included Dr. Abdullah Khorshid Kader, director of the Iraqi Institute for Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil, and that Dr. Abdullah, who has a handshake of Superman, I can assure you, had pulled me aside as he was leaving and insisted that I visit Erbil, or Hawler, as the Kurds refer to the capital of the semi-autonomous Kurdish regional government. Michael had just been forced to close Boston University's excavations and field school in Syria, and very quickly responded, "Well, when are we going?" Having extracted myself from fieldwork in 2007 to focus on backlog publications, I immediately began asking myself what I had just gotten myself into. Well, we made an initial exploratory trip to Erbil in late May 2012, and a follow-up visit in February 2013, submitting an application to conduct survey and excavation shortly after that trip. Now, and let me just point, here is Erbil here. This is the area of Iraqi Kurdistan, or under the control of the Kurdish regional government, where many of the archaeologists working in Kurdistan have gravitated to the Sulaymaniyah area, south and east of Erbil, the green dot on this map. We turn northeast to the Rawanduz-Soran district, the red dot on this map. Michael is involved in publishing the excavations of Hasanlu Tepe in the Lake Urmia basin of northwestern Iran, where former Penn Museum director Robert H. Dyson worked from 1955 to 1979, and Rawanduz put us within a stone's throw of Hasanlu. Here is Lake Urmia. Hasanlu is in this area. We're about 100 or 150 kilometers from Hasanlu on the other side of the border. And I should just tell you that a hefty report on Hasanlu period 5, the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, appeared just about a month ago. Now, Rawanduz-Soran is a rather isolated region. To reach it from Erbil, and Erbil is down here, you have to cross several mountain ridges. You have to traverse this very treacherous Spillik Pass over Harir Dog, and then you go down through this deep gorge that leads to Rawanduz. Here we're driving on the road through the Rawanduz Gorge. The gorge is called the Gali Alibey, and the road is called the Hamilton Road, after the British engineer who laid out the road from Erbil to the Iranian border after World War I. And if you're interested in this, you can take a look at A.M. Hamilton's Road Through Kurdistan, which narrates the construction of this road through rather treacherous and dangerous territory at the time. And here you can see the untamed gorge where it runs through Rawanduz itself. This gorge, as you can imagine, is a major control point for east-west travel between the Erbil Plain and the intermontane valleys to the northeast up to the Iranian plateau. If we look at the location of Rawanduz itself, here is Erbil, here is Rawanduz. Rawanduz sits at the confluence of two rivers, the Rawanduz River and the Balakian River. And these two rivers and their tributaries provide access to important passes that lead up onto the Iranian plateau. So to the east here, the Rawanduz River provides access to the Galra-Shinka Pass on up to the Lake Urmia area, Ushnuya, and the Lake Urmia area. To the west, tributaries of the Balakian River lead up to the sites of Mujesser, Sidikan, Tabzawa, and the high pass at Kelishin on up to Ishnuya and the Iranian plateau. Now, this is the Sidikan Mujesser area. It's quite bucolic with lots of cows. And it was really, in antiquity, this was the location of a place called Musasir. Now, Musasir existed already, we know, in the late 3rd millennium, but in the 1st millennium, BCE, when we know it best, Musasir was a buffer state between the Assyrians and their rival to the northeast, Urartu, whose capital, Tushpa, was on Lake Van. The Assyrian king Sargon II, in fact, attacked Musasir in his 8th campaign in 714 BCE, coming down from behind, coming down from the area of Lake Urmia through the Kelishin Pass, and sacking and burning the royal palace and the temple of Haldi, a weather deity closely associated with the Urartian dynasty, and he carried away a rich booty and annexed the whole area. This is a depiction from an Assyrian relief from Sargon's palace at Khorsabad. Now, our new research project has multiple objectives and in some senses is open-ended. But I can tell you that identifying Musasir is one of our principal interests. So, we are the only archaeologist in the area, so we thought we might as well be piggy as we had the chance to begin this project. So we asked for permission to do survey and excavations in the area around Rawanduz, survey and excavations in the area around Soran and the adjacent plain of Diana. And the plain of Diana, the British had an air base there after World War I, and this is where they stationed their Assyrian levies in that time period. It is still a Christian area. We asked for permission to do excavations at Girdadasht, and we also decided to ask for permission to do survey in the area of Sidikan and Mujesser all the way up to the Iranian border. I said we were being piggy, but that's the way it is. The KRG's colorful Director General of Antiquities, Abu Bakr Zainuddin, or Mala Awad as he is more commonly known, assured us that the KRG intended to authorize a permit for Boston University, University of Pennsylvania, as well as permits for 2 other American projects. One sponsored by the Oriental Institute, the University of Chicago, and the other by Johns Hopkins University. But I have to tell you that the process of signing those contracts was a protracted one that played itself out this summer. Under new procedures, our request for permission to conduct survey and excavations had to be approved by the Prime Minister, Nechervan Barzani, and the Council of Ministers, and then implemented through the Ministry of Municipalities and Tourism, which is the home ministry of the Directorate General of Antiquities. Even with our paperwork in the pipeline, the process took 6 to 7 weeks. Once we were in Erbil in mid-May. And I can assure you nothing happens if you are not on the ground in Erbil. I will spare you the endless cups of tea, coffee, and cold water we consumed. And in Kurdish, there is a popular expression that says, if you're stressed or anxious or worried, drink cold water. We drank a lot of cold water. But let me show you just the highlights of this process. Here is a first photograph of the heads of the three American projects, meeting with Falah Mustafa, who is the minister and head of the KRG's Department of Foreign Relations. This is Michael Dante, this is Glenn Schwartz from Johns Hopkins, and this is Gil Stein, director of the Oriental Institute, and I'll remind you, a former Penn PhD. Well, he's still a Penn PhD. A second epic photograph, and here you will see Michael holding the decree from the Council of Ministers authorizing permits for the three American projects, Boston University, Penn, Johns Hopkins, and Chicago, and the Collage de France. We're not quite sure how the Collage de France got on this piece of paper, but the piece of paper had the name Collage de France on it. This piece of paper was presented to Michael on Korik Mountain by the U.S. Consul General, Paul Stolfus, who was a very big supporter of the project. And with him was Awad Desai, who is from the Public Affairs Office at the U.S. Consulate in Erbil. As you know, there is a very active U.S. consulate presence in the KRG. The man you see here is the Kaimakam, or district governor of Rawanduz. His name is Serwan Serini. In addition to being the Kaimakam, he is a Kurdish violin prodigy whose family fled Kurdistan in Saddam's time and who ended up in Minneapolis, actually St. Paul, where he was a soloist with the Kenwood Symphony Orchestra. And you can find him on YouTube. He has lots of videos out there. The Council of Ministers letter is dated June 6th. That is 3 weeks after we had arrived in Kurdistan. And here, the ceremony in which we are signing the actual contract for excavations. This is Mullah Awad, Michael. This is Nader Babakar Mohammed, who is now the head of Erbil's Provincial Directorate General. Abdul Wahab Suleiman, and this Mr. Kafi is the Legal Affairs Advisor. So we were essentially, it had taken us another 3 to 4 weeks to get that piece of paper Michael was holding through the Ministry of Municipalities and Tourism. But we got it, and we secured the permits, not just for our own project, for Johns Hopkins, Chicago, and the Collage de France. We were thinking of sending them a bill, but I don't know. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that our excavation team had arrived in mid-May and have been on the ground the whole time. They were living in a very nice house in Rawanduz, whose natural surroundings compensated a little bit for the boredom. Our students were able to hike in the mountains, conducting informal survey of archaeological sites, so they kept busy. And we worked as we were able, drawing pottery that was stored in the Directorate General of Antiquities in Soran, pottery that had been collected by antiquities authorities from sites all over this region. So this was an important new addition to the database. And you'll see this particular photograph was taken during cocktail hour, since my Arak is there, and Marshall's Tuborg is sitting right here. I hadn't noticed that until I put this in the PowerPoint. But the Kaimakam of Rawanduz also helped to keep us busy by commissioning a site assessment at a site called Kalat Lokan, which is located here on the road between Rawanduz and Soran. And these blue lines are the wadis running through the gorge through Rawanduz. Now, Kalat Lokan is an interesting site, and the Kaimakam of Rawanduz had wanted to build a museum here. He sent a bulldozer up onto the site to plow into the middle of a fortified homestead dated to the early 19th century, the time at the very end of the Sorani Emirates. And this is the site of Kalat Lokan. I think you can probably make out where the bulldozer took a piece out of this farmstead. This is the beginning of our site assessment. We were able to expose a corner of this building and the floor, and these two support walls, or side support walls, for what I take to be a stairway or ramp leading into the building. We also got a floor of the building inside it. Here are some of the artifacts we found in the excavation. This is late about 1820s, 30s, 40s. So you see here pipe stems, pipe bowls, some crude painted pottery, and one coin dated to the time of the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid I around 1840. A little later than archaeologists are normally after, but nevertheless an interesting view into the relatively recent past. We also found a very rich faunal assemblage at the site that has our archaeozoologist Tina Greenfield very excited. Of course, it doesn't take much to get an archaeozoologist very excited, but that's okay. It was a very hot, dry summer, and brush fires were breaking out left and right as people would drive down the road throwing their cigarettes into the dry brush. These brush fires were a good reason to bring our work at Kalat Lokan to an end, but I'll tell you we were not in any danger, since these brush fires were taking place on the edge of the gorge, which you might see here, and on the other side of the road from Kalat Lokan. However, the brush fires did endanger the various soccer teams in Rawanduz who played in this small stadium. In any case, with the signing of our contract, and we signed the contract in very early July, we were able to start work. Ramadan was approaching, and the heat was increasing dramatically. I think we were at about 110 to 115 when we left. As planned, we were able to initiate excavations at Girdidasht, which means simply mound in the valley. We had chosen this site for excavation because you can see on this rather blurry map, it guards the road leading up to Sidikan Mujesser. Its very steep sides, and they were quite steep, suggest that it might reveal the remains of a fortress. This ramp leading up to it was cut in the 19th century when there was an agricultural souk on top of this site. Mullah Awad, the KRG Director General of Antiquities, came to visit us to put a ceremonial pick in the ground, wearing, of course, a black pinstripe suit. It's not exactly my choice for excavations, but it was quite nice of him to come visit to actually start the excavations formally for us. This is a topographic map of the site, or at least a partial topographic map. We were able to lay out a large sounding on the top of the mound that we intended to step down the steep slope. In this Operation 1, we uncovered remains of the Seljuk, Middle Islamic, and Late Islamic time periods, so roughly from 1000 of the Common Era up to the relatively recent present. And here you see a late stone foundation. This is a Seljuk wall, Seljuk dating to about the 11th and 12th centuries, the stones laid in herringbone fashion, that we uncovered as we began to step down the side of the mound. Our second smaller sounding, which we laid out because we wanted something earlier, was quite restricted, but nevertheless we uncovered in this area a mud brick wall that is at least 3 meters wide and running with the circumference of the mound. I don't think it's very deep. We were getting a lot of pebbles down here, suggestive that we were at the bottom of the wall, but it is running with the circumference of the mountain, and it is big, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a fortification wall. Now, the fills above this mud brick wall contain some Chalcolithic sherds, but a lot of sherds dating to the 2nd millennium. In particular, painted haburware, which you see examples of here, and some open plates with inwardly beveled rims painted red, suggestive of a date in the later 2nd millennium. So this may be a very early wall. We'll have to go back next time. It was certainly our intention to expand this area. Now, the thing is, in a field season that was full of delays, we also had a lot of interesting surprises. And the excavations at Girdidash got cut a little bit short by accidental discoveries up in the mountains up here in the Sidikan Mujesser area. Unbeknownst to us, as we were initiating work at Girdidash, the Ministry of Municipalities, our great foe, their work crews had begun widening the road between Sidikan, the Kelishin Pass, and the Iranian border, and the earth-moving equipment cut through an Islamic cemetery, stone-built tomb chambers, and cut through settlement sites as well. Abdul Wahab Suleiman, the Director General in Soran, asked us to step up and help with the salvage efforts, and we were only too happy to do that. We labeled these sites, the cemetery site, we labeled Gabristan-e Tabzawa, since this is near the little village of Tabzawa. The settlement sites we called Gunde Tabzawa. So here you see us on the road leaving Sidikan, heading toward the Kelishin Pass and the Iranian border. You can see where the earth-moving machinery has cut the hillside away, these large piles of dirt, making this road quite treacherous because it drops off precipitously in this area. This is what greeted us as we arrived at Gabristan-e Tabzawa. And you can see this stone-built chamber with bones protruding out of the soil. And here you see this stone-built tomb chamber after about 2 weeks of work on a highway that was actually quite busy with earth-moving equipment moving back and forth. Here you can see a kind of section through this stone-built tomb chamber. You can see here the walls, the stones cantilevered out, these large stones forming the roof. And here you can see what looks like a kind of pitch slate roof over the top of the whole thing. Now, in terms of stratigraphy, there is an original floor down here at the bottom, some stone collapse, and then a substantial fill with a new floor for later burials above. So we found a tremendous number of disarticulated skeletons on this later floor. We found a very large number of disarticulated skeletons of the original burials of the tomb, we think, down here, along with a number of artifacts, including this copper alloy bracelet, the ends of which have serpent heads on it. And here you can see a drawing of the bracelet with cross sections, and you can see the hatching along the surface of the bracelet itself. Some rings or earrings here, and a few beads, some glass, some stone. And a tremendous amount of pottery. Most of it broken, but some whole vessels. In terms of the date of this tomb, our German colleague Stefan Kroll puts this bridge-spouted vessel in the very late Achaemenid period, about 4th century or late 4th century BCE, and he says he sees nothing in the tomb that would suggest a date too much later than that. We were able to retrieve some carbon for radiocarbon samples, and so that would work fairly well with this date in here, the late 4th century, though the tomb could be a little bit later. Now, if we back up a little bit, moving from Gabristani Tabzawa to Sidikan, there are a whole string of settlements that the earth-moving equipment cut through. You can see the stone walls here topple on one side, floors covered with heavy ash. In some places, the walls were still preserved up to 2.5 meters high. So these are going to be very interesting. And what is even more important are the radiocarbon dates. We were able to bring pieces of charcoal from large roofing beams back, and we ran the radiocarbon determinations at the University of Arizona. You'll see that the earliest of these are in the 12th century, 12th, 11th, 10th century. The latest of these may be at the end of the 9th or early 8th centuries. So we are currently positing that this site was occupied probably around, or begun around 1100, and probably ended somewhere in the early 8th century. So it covers the whole of the Iron Age. Now, Sargon passed through here at the end of the 8th century in 714. So we are quite hopeful that we have an outlier of Musasir's capital that Sargon himself burned. Now, that is quite wishful thinking, I think, but time will tell what we actually have on our hands. So, I can tell you, as when we were, the work in this area was really very hard. In order to dig those tombs, we had to stand on ladders, getting into them, and it was very hot. By this time, July is the hottest month, and I think we weren't Englishmen, but we were certainly mad dogs for being there. Fortunately, at the end of the day, we were able to cool off. At least the male members of the team were able to cool off by jumping in this pool that is created by a dam on the Tabzawa Chai. Now, this water is coming down out of the high Zagros Mountains. This is snowmelt. And I can tell you it was about 30 degrees. So you're going from 110 to 30, and hypothermia is, on the horizon. This is one of my new students, and I think it's important to take emaciated students to the field with you, so nobody can tell whether you're starving them or not. Actually, he ate an entire box of moon pies on the way up to... So, the most important result of our summer stay in Iraqi Kurdistan is that we got our survey and excavations off the ground. And we're looking forward to returning in May and June 2014 to continue work at Girdadasht, as well as salvage excavations in the Sidikan Mujassir area, all the way up to the Kalishin Pass. And I should tell you that Gabristani Tabzawa and Gundi Tabzawa are 5 or 10 kilometers from the Iranian border. Now, we owe a lot of thanks, and we need to acknowledge all of those who provided financial support and who provided other types of encouragement. I do want to thank 2 people in particular, and these are the 2 cards I have put here. I have a stack of cards this high from the summer. The first of these I have mentioned already, the Kaimakam of Rawanduz, Serwan Serini. Serwan intervened on more than one occasion personally to secure pieces of paper or other important information that we needed. And he gave very sage advice that helped us navigate the political pitfalls of the Kurdish bureaucracy. One of the most important pieces of advice he gave us was as we were working our way through the Ministry of Municipalities. We didn't know exactly what we were doing. We were working with Kubad Talabani, who is the Minister of Coordination and Follow-up. And if you have a Minister of Coordination and Follow-up, you might think there's a problem there. But they do. And we're working with Talabani, who is part of the PUK, or the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, one of the major political parties. And we just weren't getting anywhere. And Sirwan called us up one day and he said, guys, I mean, this is the way he talks, guys, you've got a Barzani problem. He said, you're working with Talabani, but the Minister of Municipalities, Dilshad Shahab, belongs to the PDK, the Democratic Party of Kurdistan, and is of the Barzani party. You need to get somebody from the Barzani party to introduce you to the right people in this ministry in order to work your way through it. So Nader Babakar Mohammed from the Directorate General belonged to the Barzani party. He took us and introduced us to the man whose name you may be able to see here, Burhan Ismail Abdussalam. His email address is burhanpa. Now, it turns out that Burhan has a degree in civil engineering from an American university, and when he got his degree, he went to work for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and lived in Harrisburg for 25 years. He's a good son of the Commonwealth. And he took us by the hand and walked us through the process. And if it hadn't been as savvy as we may or may not be, if it hadn't been for the Kaimakam of Rawanduz and Burhan, we may still be drinking cold water. In any case, with that, and that appropriate thanks to Julian Seegers, Steve Tinney for providing support for the project, I'll stop and happy to take your questions.
Great, thank you. So I gave a talk about my work in Iraq in August. Some of you might have attended. I wasn't actually here. It was done over a cell phone, but supposedly people actually came. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about what I'm doing in Azerbaijan. Although to a large extent, we're still in the same area of the world where Richard just was talking, the highlands of the Near East. Let me see. All right, so soon after I began working in Azerbaijan, it became abundantly clear to me that no one outside of the country had any idea where the country was or how to pronounce its name. And that if I didn't, keep a map with me at all times, people would lose interest very quickly. So here's the requisite map. Unfortunately, when I'm in Azerbaijan, people often ask me, what Americans know about Azerbaijan. And I always have to lie and say, well, of course they know Azerbaijan, don't worry. Now, I actually came to Azerbaijan in the first place because it is such an unknown, not only today for most Americans, but essentially in the past. It's one of the places that has seen almost no archaeological excavation in the Near East, one of the only places. So essentially, the ancient history of the country still remains to be written. And so we've been working on this over the last 6 years or so. Now, this area was basically always a frontier. It's been a frontier between different empires, between the Russian steppes and between the ancient Near East for the last 3,000 years or so. And the project so far has really focused on three things. Considering this area as a borderland, as this frontier zone between different cultures, considering its relationship, as Steve said, to various external empires, which I'll sort of introduce in a few minutes, maybe even places you've heard of, we'll see, And then the project now is moving into a new dimension where we're going to start thinking about what city life was like in this area, and also possibly what the sorts of cities that existed in the South Caucasus in the first millennium BC might be able to tell us about suburban sprawl today. That might be a little bit too ambitious, but we'll see. So this is along Gala, which is a fortress site where we've basically been working since 2008. You can see this hill here called Karatepe, and basically the entire top of the hill is a giant castle. There are a series of 5 fortification walls that line the sides of the mountains, some of which you can see here. And at the top, an area of about 40 acres, about 15 hectares. There's an area that's mostly occupied by 2 palaces and a large temple. So what I want to tell you about today then is Alangala's relationship, this castle, which we've now realized was probably basically at the center of a series of previously lost kingdoms from the first millennium BC, kingdoms that we didn't really know anything about, except for perhaps a few brief mentions in sources, famous sources like Urartian inscriptions, because so many people have heard of Urartu, until we started working there. So what we're going to talk about today is what's happening at Alangala and how it's related to these basically 4 empires. Urartu, and this is basically the map of Assyria and Urartu. So what Richard was talking about is the area basically, where are we? I should be able to do this. Right here. Here's Mitsasir. This is Urartu, and that's that borderland. And what I'm working on is an area right here, which is a borderland to the sort of undiscovered territory. The relationship with the Seleucid Empire, so basically the empire that's established after Alexander the Great destroys the Persian Empire, which had been the greatest empire ever seen up to that point. And then finally, and to me actually most surprisingly, the relationship of this area to the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. Because I was in Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan seems so incredibly far away from Rome, I never expected to find Roman material here. And it was only after we started finding Roman coins that I realized that actually we have a lot of Roman material. I just hadn't been recognizing it because we're so far away from anything that we would really expect. So I'm going to begin and talk really briefly about the first period at Alangala, when it's the center of a kingdom which probably comprises most of the area of Nakhichevan, and it lies on the border of Urartu. During this period in time, the fortress is built for the first time. The fortifications, as you can see here, are established. And Alangala has an unusual relationship with its neighbor Urartu. Basically, when I first went here, I just assumed it was going to be part of Urartu. And it was only as we started to excavate, and actually, somewhat embarrassingly, as I started to present my results, saying, look at this Urartian capital, that people said, no, that doesn't look Urartian at all. You clearly have something else going on. And what I realized was that Alangala is, in fact, to a large extent, probably a kingdom that exists to resist Urartu. It's probably established precisely because of the threat that the rise of this empire meant to the people living on its borders. And it's built in such a way as to, for people in the know at 800 BC, to show its distance from Urartu. So I'm showing you what our architecture looks like. And you can see that they're very into these sort of gigantic blocks. You know, this is what they want. If a block is not, say, 3 feet across, it's clearly not big enough to build with. And it's pretty, I think it's pretty cool. But it's also pretty rough. And it's quite possibly made to look like the mountain itself, and to really exaggerate the power of the mountain. And if you see, it actually looks quite different from the Urartian architecture, which is really doing something else entirely, right? It's very smooth, it's solid, and in some ways, this distinction is a really clear distinction that you see throughout its architecture. Urartian architecture emphasizes distance from the natural world. It's very square. It's very smooth. It's very geometrical. While our architecture instead emphasizes this continuity with the mountain itself. So we can see this also in the way that the fortresses are built. So we have several different buildings at the top of this site, while Urartian palaces tend to just have one building. The temple is inside the palace. There's nothing that's distinctive. Nonetheless, people within Ulangala are still part of this wider world. And we know this from looking at the pottery. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about my student Susanna's Fishman work here. We found very little clearly imported pottery here. Some of it is right here. This is another sign that this was not Urartian. But Susanna has been looking at thin sections of pottery to look at how the pottery was made and where the clays come from. And what she's found is that there's actually a transformation during this period. So this is what the period immediately before the palace is built, what the pottery looks like. And this is what it looks like here. And the only thing you guys are looking at in these two charts is how different these pie charts look like, right? So this versus this. And basically what happens is during this period, the way people make pottery is entirely transformed. So even though they're not part of this external empire, and they're very consciously resisting it, very consciously not adopting its symbols of power, they nonetheless are taking part in this much wider world where there's more trade in pottery and in the goods that the pottery would carry, and there's also probably more artisans, more craftspeople moving back and forth. They also, and this was very exciting for us, decide to adopt writing in this place. So we found the first evidence of writing ever found in Azerbaijan. It was a it's basically my 15 minutes of fame have happened, but in Azerbaijan, right? There were lots of news reports, the president came to visit us, and all on account of this, which was the first piece of writing that we found. So they're adopting cuneiform from the ancient Near East, but they're never really using it, as far as we can tell, very widely. They're just using it on jars. And in some places, we actually have evidence of what's probably pseudo-writing. And that what I think is going on here is that this is made to look like cuneiform. Steve is looking at it, and he doesn't think it looks like cuneiform at all, and I agree. But I think that if you've only ever seen this, you might think that this has some sort of meaning. So I think this is really the edge of the world of writing. Okay, so all of my periods end very violently. Most of what we find in terms of artifacts in this fortress that are not bits of pottery or animal bones are these. We have, I don't even know how many hundred of bronze and iron arrowheads we've found, as well as these, which we assume are slingshot bullets. Since, after all, this is a fortress, people come up here to try to avoid invaders, but it seemed to not work very well for most of the period. So the second period I want to talk about is when Ulangala is at the edge of the Hellenistic world. And what's going on here is a little bit different than in the first period of time, because rather than resisting these sort of external symbols of power, people at the site instead are choosing to adopt both Persian symbolism, so from the defeated Persian Empire, as well as symbolism drawn from Athens, from the Hellenistic world. And we can see this really nicely first in these. Sorry, it always has to be pottery for archaeology. And these are basically bowls, some of the only signs of the Persian Empire that we find throughout its entire span, from Afghanistan to the Sudan, and which you can see here on the reliefs from the Persian capital a Persepolis, and these are being used at Elangala after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire. And these bowls might not seem to really matter, but they're part of this larger symbolism of the king's meal, which basically represents the economic integration of the entire empire in the provincial system. I mean, they're important enough that this is the capital, this is the center of power, and that's what's decorating it. The other thing we find, and which you saw in that picture, are lots and lots and lots of column elements. You can see some of them here. Now, we found something like 34 of these. So it was kind of exciting, actually. And we spent a lot of time basically trying to figure out how they would have gone together. Now, if you guys look at them, you probably can see that they're pretty crude, rather like those huge monumental blocks I showed you before. And in this case, that's not really intentional. It's because they're not finished. So if you can see this and this, these are lifting bosses that would have been used to put these into place. These are really, really heavy, as you would imagine. We had to take I think it took 10 people to try to move half of one when we were working. And then these would have been removed and smoothed off. So what we did was basically try to rebuild the columns to see how this palace would have looked if it had ever been completed, since whatever was happening here during the Hellenistic period was never finished. So we were able to do this by using this as a measurement, measuring all of our column bases, and then using ratios of how high columns tend to be to reconstruct the basic height. And we realized that this was supposed to be the base, and quite interestingly, it looks very much like the sorts of bases that are used in Athens at the Erechtheion. So you can see some Attic bases from Athens and from the site of Ai Khanum, another Hellenistic city in Afghanistan. But in the same building, they were also using these Persian columns that have this sort of bell-shaped base. And here are those columns from different Persian cities. So what we did is basically reconstructed where the columns would have been placed. We could tell that they were supposed to be here from what survived of the architecture. And we could sort of get a sense of what the palace might have looked like, at least this large courtyard, if it had ever been finished. And what's really interesting about this for us is that people here are choosing to use these very different elements. And they must be doing so intentionally. I'm sure that anyone who was alive at, say, 315 BC and had seen the end of the Persian Empire really knew what mattered in the Persian Empire. And columns were really a symbol of power for Persia. And they also knew how columns were integrated into a Greek religious tradition. So what they're doing at Elangala is something which is neither Persian nor Greek. They're neither making a temple with a portico or making a columned hall like a Persian palace. They're doing something that's entirely different, and which sadly, because once again we start finding those arrowheads, ended before it really began. So I'm going to draw to a close by talking about the relationship of this area with Rome, the unexpected relationship. And this, as you guys can see, is a Latin inscription that was found elsewhere in Azerbaijan. During this period, Elangala serves a very different role than it did during the earlier two periods. Rather than being a palace, a fortified center, it instead is basically just a fortified village. So we have evidence from a survey, a magnetometry survey of the mound, that it was mostly covered with small houses, like this one that we excavated. The ruins of the palace itself were not reoccupied during this period. What we find instead are these giant pits with the remains of what I think were probably ritual feasts. So bowls like this, interesting, strange bone artifacts like that, and huge quantities of bones from sheep, well, mostly from sheep, so very specific cuts of lamb and mutton that people are eating in this area. And I think they're probably doing this because the palace is still there, it's still imposing, and it probably is a special place for the people who have chosen to live in this town. Now, we have evidence that people are related to the external empires of Parthia and Rome in different ways, and that people have different access to wealth. So we excavated part of a house, probably a villa, and it's the only place on the site where we find this quite attractive Parthian pottery. They seem to be the only people who somehow have the ability to import perhaps these high status goods. On the other hand, this here, Susanna Fishman, my PhD student, showed through her analysis of the pottery that it was actually made probably in Artashat, Armenia, one of the capitals of Armenia during this time period. And if you look at it and you know something about Roman pottery, which of course I sadly did not until very recently, it looks very much like this red, glossy Roman pottery that you find everywhere, from Britain to now Azerbaijan. And this is actually found throughout the site. So for some reason, what's imported from Persia seems to be high status, but this pottery just becomes commonly accepted. Now, our final evidence of imports comes from this burial, which once again combines material from these two empires. So you can see that it's a Pithos burial, and the jar itself is basically very much at home in Parthia, in Iran. But what we find inside it, like these two pomegranate vases, is entirely Roman. So you can see here those two vases. You can see one of the coins here, and you can maybe even try to read a little bit of the Latin. You can see this nice bead here, which is actually a Phoenician eye bead. And then we have a nice signet ring here. And we found 5 signet rings and I think 8 coins in this tomb. All of the coins are the same coin, and they all basically are a coin of Augustus. So I wanted to close by talking about what we're going to do next summer. And basically, the whole idea is to finally move off of Elangala, move off of the mountain, and try to get a sense of how other people, especially during those first 2 periods, related to the external world. And so we documented last summer, and hope to excavate next summer, an extensive settlement that surrounds this hill, and which basically comprises an area of about 5 square kilometers, which is really big. So it's about 500 hectares, which makes it actually one of the largest cities known from the ancient Near East. There are other cities that are larger, but it's really quite unusual. And it seems like it was probably walled. So we find evidence of walls in different areas in the highlands where they would be preserved. So what we hope to do, because as you can see, most of the city is being cultivated right now and has been pretty much destroyed. So we hope to work here, where no one is working, and where we can see from the soil pattern what looks like possible evidence of walls beneath the soil, and where there's also quite dense pottery scatter from this period. Now, from what we can tell from our work so far, which is basically spending a lot of time walking in these fields, it seems likely that this settlement is quite different from what you find elsewhere in the Middle East. That rather than a dense city like Nippur, where Richard used to work, we have a very widely scattered, almost suburban-looking city. Possibly something more like modern Phoenix, or even, well, I guess outskirts of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a pretty dense city. And so this is actually quite interesting because archaeologists have begun to look at cities like this, cities that seem to represent ancient sprawl, and that are very different from what we normally think of when we think of ancient cities, where we normally think of walled spaces that are firmly bounded and that are very tightly knit. And so what we'd like to do is look at how a city like this might have operated in the past to see what sprawl was like and what that might mean for the present and the future. So I just want to close, of course, by thanking people. This is your Azerbaijani phrase of the day. Teşekkür ederim. We thank you. And open for questions.